There are barns in the Kentucky hills that were raised to cure tobacco and ended up holding a man. In the last autumn of 1889, three brothers, deacons of their own church, chained their preacher inside one and kept him there through 2 seasons of snow. They did not call it captivity. The men called it a work of mercy, ordered by God, to scour a rot out of the man's soul, and they performed it in perfect silence, because they believed the silence was what made the rite holy. Before I take you into this one, do what I've asked of you before. Look down at the description of this video and at the pinned comment at the top of the page. There's a link there to the Appalachian dossier, the records that were quietly erased from official American files between 1843 and 1891. Go look at it now, or come back to it after, and it'll be waiting. And one more thing. Before the story starts, wherever you're listening from right now, the town, the country, the road, if there's no town, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them, and I'm always surprised how far this voice reaches, now to the place where this happened. Stillhouse Creek isn't on any map that was ever sold in a store. It sat, in 1889, in the head of a cove below the Virginia line, in the burly tobacco country of eastern Kentucky, where the ridges fold in on themselves and the hollows run narrow and dark. The people who lived there didn't call it a town. They called it the creek, the way a man calls a house, the home place, and the name covered maybe 9 families tied to one another, by blood and by the land they had cleared, and by a church that met in a room above a corn crib. A man could ride from the county seat to Stillhouse Creek in a long day, if the weather held, and in 2 days, if it didn't, and in no days at all, once the snow came down off the ridge. The passes closed early in that country, and they stayed closed. A hollow could go a whole winter without a stranger's boot on its ground, and the families inside it had stopped minding, which over enough seasons amounted to the same thing as liking it. The church at Stillhouse Creek wasn't much of a building, and it didn't need to be. The people there kept to the old way of the Mountain Baptists, the kind who wanted no paid minister and no Sunday school and no mission board sending strangers down to tell them how to believe. They sang without an instrument, a leader lining out the words and the rest following a beat behind. They washed one another's feet at the communion service. And the business of the fellowship, the discipline, and the keeping of the books was handled by the men, by the deacons, in a meeting after the preaching. In a place like Stillhouse Creek, the deacons weren't ornaments. They were the law the people recognized, the only one that reached up the hollow in any season. A dispute over a fence line, a question of who had right to the spring, a man who had gone to drink and not come home. All of it came to the deacons before it ever came to a sheriff, and most of it never came to a sheriff at all. The sheriff was a day's ride away, and the snow was between, and the snow lay on that ground more months than it didn't. The biggest thing a man built in that country wasn't his house. It was his barn. Tobacco barn was the measure of a household, the way a man's store of corn or his number of children was the measure, and the Ballard's barn was the largest on the creek, raised by Hiram and his brothers in a week with the help of the neighbors. The logs squared with a broad axe and the walls set dry without mortar. Through the autumn it ran hot with the cure, the vents cracked to let the wet out of the leaves, and through the winter it stood shut and dark and smelling of dust, and the men went into it only to check the cure and to chase out the rats. A barn like that, in a hollow like that, could hold a man through a winter, and no one would think to look. By the last week of October in 1889 the tobacco was hung, and the vents were shuttered, and the first hard frost had come down off the ridge. The hollow was drawing in for the winter, the way it always did, like a man pulling a blanket up to his chin. Nothing about that autumn looked any different from the 8 autumns before it, and nothing about it looked different to the people who lived there. The wrongness could arrive in the shape of the most ordinary season in the world, and no one outside the hollow would ever know. The man the brothers chained was named Elias Carmichael. He was 41 years old that autumn, tall for that country, maybe 5'10", narrow through the chest, with a long sunburned face and a beard. He kept short with a straight razor, whether the creek had hot water or not. His hands were the hands of a man who worked a tobacco crop and a preaching circuit both. Rough at the heel of the palm, the nails kept clean for the pulpit. He had a soft voice, and he rarely raised it. When something weighed on him, he spoke less, not more, and the people who sat under him had learned to listen for the silences between his words, rather than the words themselves. Elias wasn't a seminary man. He'd never been to one, and he didn't want to go. He was a farmer who preached the kind of minister that country produced, and he rode a short circuit to 2 congregations over the next ridge when the weather let him, carrying his Bible in a canvas sling, because the binding had gone soft and the book would fall open of its own weight if he let it. He'd preached at Stillhouse Creek for 9 years. He'd buried their dead and married their young and sat up with their sick, and he'd baptized at least one of the Ballard brothers in the creek itself, on a cold morning in the spring of 1882. The Ballards were 3, and they were the deacons of Stillhouse Creek, and they had been the deacons for as long as anyone on the creek could remember. Hiram was the eldest. 48, broad and heavy through the shoulders, with a face gone gaunt early from a fever he'd taken in his 20th winter and never quite put off. His hands were big and square, the hands of a man who'd notched more tear poles than anyone on the creek. He read his Bible every morning before light, and he read it the way a man reads a contract, looking for what was owed and to whom. Enoch was 44, the middle one, narrower and quicker, the brother who kept the church's books. He wrote everything down in a steady, even hand, in a ledger he carried in the breast pocket of his coat, and there was ink under the nails of his right hand that had been there so long it become part of the color of him. He was the one the others trusted to remember. He remembered everything, and he forgot nothing. He thought God would want a record of. Silas was 40, the youngest, the tallest of the 3, raw-boned and slow in his movements, with a stillness about him that the other men on the creek had learned to read the way they read weather. He didn't speak at meeting unless the matter was grave, and when he did, the room went quiet on its own. He was the strongest of the brothers and the one with the least to say, and the combination was the kind of thing a man didn't argue with. Now, I should tell you something about these 3 before the autumn turns. The 3 of them moved through the life of the hollow the way a single body moves. Hiram at the front, Enoch with the books, Silas at the back, where his stillness could do its work. When a family on the creek fell into a quarrel, it was the Ballards who came to the door, and they came together. And they came once, and the matter was settled before they left. The people trusted them with their disputes, because the brothers were fair, and they trusted them with their souls, because the brothers were devout. And over enough years, the 2 trusts had grown into one, so that to doubt a Ballard in that hollow would have felt to anyone there like doubting the church itself. Between the preacher and the deacons, the piety was real, and it ran both ways, and that's the part that's hardest to hold in the head. The men who chained Elias Carmichael weren't strangers to him, and they weren't his enemies. They were the men he'd trusted most in the hollow, and they believed, with the whole of their souls, that chaining him was the most Christian thing they had ever done. The months before that last autumn, something had begun to shift in the way the brothers looked at their preacher. It wasn't a sudden thing. It moved the way weather moves in that country, slow and out of sight, and by the time anyone might have read it on a face, the faces had already closed. What the brothers had begun to see in Elias Carmichael is the question this account turns on, and it isn't a question the record ever answers plainly. In the mountain religion of that country, God didn't always speak through the Sunday sermon. He spoke to a man alone, in a field, in a barn, in the hour before dawn, and what he said carried a weight no meeting could overrule. The people at Stillhouse Creek believed this the way they believed the ridge was real. A man who'd been shown a thing by God wasn't to be argued with by men who hadn't. That was the order of it, and it had kept the Hollow together for a long time. What Hiram Ballard said God showed him came to him in the loft of his own barn, on a night in late September of 1889, while he was checking the cure on the last of his tobacco. He did not announce it at meeting. He told his brothers, and he told them that the Lord had revealed to him a rot in the soul of Elias Carmichael, a hidden corruption the man carried and hid and wouldn't name, and that it was eating outward toward the flock. The remedy, Hiram said, wasn't the remedy the church had always used. The church had a remedy for sin in a member, and the deacons could exclude a man, could cut him from the fellowship, could stand him before the congregation and name his fault and turn him out. That was the old discipline, and it was clean, and it left the man to the Lord and to his own conscience. Hiram told his brothers the Lord had refused that remedy, that the rot was too deep and the man too valuable to lose, and that the Lord had ordered a different work, a private work, a scouring, done in mercy and in secret, so the flock needn't know, and the man might be made clean and returned to his pulpit whole. Enoch wrote it down. That was the first thing he did before the night was out. In the ledger in his coat, in his steady hand, the date and the place and the words the Lord had given his brother. Silas did not speak through any of it. He sat with his hands on his knees and he listened, and when Hiram was finished, Silas nodded once, and that was the consent of the youngest given. Two brothers accepted the eldest's word because the eldest had been shown a thing by God, and in that country a man did not argue with what God had shown another man, not if he hadn't been shown it himself. There's a particular weight to a thing decided in a loft in the dark. The three men sat with the cure of the tobacco all around them, the leaves hanging brown and still on their sticks, and the lamp between them threw their shadows up against the roof logs, and the decision they'd made had the feel of a thing that had already happened somewhere else and was only now being shown to them. Hiram did not ask them to swear anything. He did not need to. The brother, who'd been shown a thing by God, had only to say what he'd been shown, and the work was already begun in the moment he said it, the way a stone is already falling the instant it leaves the hand. What the rot was the record doesn't say. Hiram did not name a sin. He did not say Elias had drank, or stolen, or lain with another man's wife, or turned from the faith. He said only that the Lord had shown him a corruption in the man, and that the Lord had ordered the scouring, and that was enough. Three sober men, in a loft, in the dark, decided to take a man and chain him and scour his soul, and the only evidence they needed was the word of one of them, given in the name of God. They did not decide when, they did not decide how. Those were left to the Lord, Hiram said, and the Lord would make the time plain. The time came 7 weeks later, on the first cold night of November, when the last of the tobacco was hung and the barn stood empty of everything but the cure and the dark. They came for him after the evening meal on the first night of November. All three came, and they came in their coats, and they came on foot because the barn wasn't far, and a man doesn't ride a horse to a thing he believes God has told him to do. Elias was in the room above the corn crib, reading by the light of a tallow lamp, when the door opened and the three of them stood in it. He knew them the way a man knows his own deacons. He set the Bible down. Hiram spoke first, and he spoke low, and he said only what God had shown him, that there was a rot in Elias's soul, and that the Lord had refused the old remedy, and that the three of them had been chosen to scour it out, in mercy and in secret. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse Elias of any act. The work would be done in the barn, he said, and it would be done in silence, and when the rot was gone, Elias would be returned to his pulpit clean. Elias looked at the three faces in the door, the faces of men he had baptized and buried and fed, and he didn't yet understand what was happening to him. They walked him to the barn. Elias went with them because he couldn't yet believe what was beginning, and because the 3 men on either side of him were the men he trusted most in the hollow, and because the night was cold, and the barn was close, and a part of him still thought this was some errand of the church he hadn't been told of. The barn was the Ballard barn, the one Hiram had built with his own hands in the summer of 1884. It was a log frame barn, square and heavy, with a gabled roof and walls of vertical boards, set edge to edge, and the only light that came into it came through the cracks between the boards and through the vent boards that swung open on iron hinges. Inside, the tier poles crossed the loft in rows 4 feet apart, with the last of the season's tobacco still hung on sticks between them, the leaves long and brown and dry, and giving off the slow, sweet dust of the cure. A charcoal fire burned low in a ring of stones on the dirt floor, more for the tobacco than for any man. The loft above had been cleared and swept clean, and a pallet of corn shucks had been laid against the back wall, and a chain hung from the nearest tier pole. Elias stood in the door of the loft, and he looked at the pallet and the chain and the cold ring of stones, and the understanding came into him the way water comes into a boot, slow and from the bottom up. He turned to the brothers to ask them what this was, and the faces that looked back at him were the faces of men he had known all his life, and they were closed, and they were calm, and they held no anger at all. The calm was the thing that would undo him, though he didn't know it yet. A man could fight another man who hated him. What he did not know was how to fight men who believed they were saving his soul. Hiram took the chain down from the pole and wound it once around Elias's waist and closed it with a flat iron and a pin, and the pin drove through the link with a sound like a nail driven into a board. There was slack enough in the chain for a man to stand and to lie, and not enough for him to reach the door. The door was barred, and then chained on the outside, and then the 3 brothers stood in the loft and looked at the man they'd chained, and not one of them spoke. That was the first silence. It was the silence of men who'd begun a sacred work, and a sacred work, in their understanding, was not to be profaned by talk. They left him there. They took the lamp with them, and the loft went to the dark, and the only light was the low red of the charcoal through the cracks in the floor. The cold came in through the vent boards in a slow stream, the way cold moves in a barn, and the smell of the curing tobacco filled the loft, sweet and close and dead. Elias sat on the pallet of corn shucks, and he listened to the chain settle against the pole, and he began, slowly, to understand. No one was coming to look for him that night. No one was coming the next night. The only men who knew where he was were the men who chained him, and they believed, down in the bone, that they were doing him a kindness. The brothers did not come the first night or the second. They came on the 3rd evening, after the chores were done, and the stock was settled, and they came in the dark, and they came in silence. This is the part of the account where the shape of the work becomes plain, and it isn't the shape most people would guess. They did not beat the man, or rail at him, or accuse him of anything because there was nothing yet to accuse him of. The rot was a thing of the soul, and a thing of the soul was not reached with a fist. It was reached with a rite. They came each evening, the 3 of them, and they performed the same order of work, beginning by standing Elias in the center of the loft and placing the heavy Bible in his hands, open, and he was to hold it out before him at the height of his chest and not let it drop, and he was to stand so for as long as they stood with him. Then they knelt him on the bare dirt, and on the nights the cold was worst, they knelt him on the dry corn shucks, which were stiff and curled and bit into the knees through the cloth. They drew water from the spring in a tin bucket, and they poured it over his head and his shoulders while he said the lines of the psalm they'd chosen for the night, the 7th, the 32nd, the 51st, the psalms of a man broken and brought low. On the fast days they brought no food, only the cup of water. And the fast days came more often as the winter deepened. And through all of it, through every order of the work, the brothers did not speak a single word to him. Some nights the order ran longer than a man could stand it, and on those nights the brothers knelt Elias against the tier pole itself, and bound the chains short so he couldn't shift his weight, and he stayed there in the dark between their visits with the iron at his back and the cold coming up through the boards. The only sound was the settling of the tobacco leaves overhead, and now and then the low voice of one of the brothers reading his own scripture on the other side of the loft. The man they were scouring was 10 feet from them, and they read as though he weren't there, because in the order of the work he wasn't a man in that hour. He was a vessel, and the vessel was being cleaned. The silence was not cruelty. It was doctrine. Hiram had taught his brothers that to speak to Elias during the work would be to profane it, the way a priest doesn't talk his way through a sacrament. God's judgment, Hiram said, was performed without word, and the scouring they'd been ordered to perform was to be done in God's likeness. So they stood their watch in turn, each brother taking a third of the night, and they read their own Bibles by the light of the low coal, and their faces were blank, and they did not raise a hand in anger, and they did not raise their voices, because the work had no use for anger and no use for voices. The absence of rage is the thing that's hardest to sit with, reading this back. What kept a man on his knees in the cold wasn't rage, it was patience. Through the first winter, the body of Elias Carmichael began to come apart in the small ways a body comes apart, when it's kept in the cold and the dark and fed on the edge of starvation. His hands, the hands that had held the Bible for 9 years in the pulpit, began to shake when he held the book out, and then they began to shake when he did not. The cold came up through the dirt floor and into his knees, and they didn't unbend all the way. By the end of the season, he recited the Psalms until his voice went thin, and then went out, and on the nights his voice failed. The brothers poured the water in silence, and let the silence stand in for the prayer. There's a danger in this kind of captivity that's worse than the cold, and worse than the hunger. And it's the danger that the man in the chains will come to believe the men who are doing it to him. 3 men whom Elias had trusted, 3 men who taught him the faith he taught, came to him every evening and told him with the whole weight of their certainty, and without a single word of doubt, that a rot was in his soul, and that what they were doing was the cure. A man kept long enough in a barn, with no other voice, begins to wonder whether the rot is real, because the only language left to him is the language his captors taught him, and in that language what they're doing to him is mercy. By the deep of the first winter, Elias had begun to pray, not to be set free, but to be made worthy of the scouring. That's the line the account doesn't come back from. Before we go any further, if you've made it this far without subscribing, tap that button now. And if you're hearing this story on a channel that isn't ours, someone has taken our work without permission, and I'd ask you to report it for us. Now let me take you back to the barn and to the second winter. When the first winter broke, the brothers did not let him go. The melt came off the ridge in March, the way it always did, and the passes opened, and a man could ride to the county seat in a day again, and the brothers told the Hollow that Elias had gone to ride an extended circuit down into Tennessee and would be away for a season. The Hollow believed them, because the deacons had said it, and because in that country the word of a deacon carried the weight of a sworn statement, and because no one on the creek had any reason to doubt the men who kept the books and the discipline and the keys to the meeting room. Elias stayed in the loft through the spring and the summer. The barn shuddered against the heat, the vents closed, the door chained, and the brothers brought him water and meal in the dark hours, and the cover held, because the isolation that had made the captivity possible now made the lie airtight. Through the warm months the silence did not lift with the snow. The brothers came to him in the hours before dawn, as they had come all winter, and they came without a word then too, because the silence wasn't only for the cold months and the rite, it was for always. He did not see the sun from March until the snow came again. A man kept out of the light through a Kentucky summer loses the months from his body as much as from his mind, and by the time the second autumn came down off the ridge, Elias had begun to forget what the ridge looked like, which is a thing a man does not forget unless something has been done to the part of him that holds the world in shape. The second winter, the work changed because the rot hadn't been purged. It couldn't be purged because it wasn't there, and a cure aimed at a sickness that doesn't exist can only ever fail. And a failed cure in the hands of men who can't doubt doesn't lead to doubt. It leads to more cure. The fast days came more often. The water drawn from the spring was colder, hauled up from the iced pool in the dark, and it was poured in greater measure. The hours Elias spent, chained, standing in the dark, grew longer, until there were nights he stood from sundown to the first gray, reciting a psalm he could no longer hear himself say. The silence of the brothers deepened. By the second winter they no longer read their Bibles through the watch. They simply stood, and they stood without expression, and they waited for the work to do what the work had been promised to do. By then the work had stopped being Hiram's alone. Nock had begun to see the rot himself, in the way Elias held his head, in the way the man's voice caught on certain words, and Silas had begun to bring his own choices to the order of the night, a longer fast, a colder pouring, a psalm of his own choosing. The revelation had passed out of the hands of the man who first received it and into the hands of all three, and it no longer needed the original vision to sustain it. 3 men in a hollow with no outside check had talked a mercy into a hunger, and the hunger was feeding itself. By the deep of the second winter, Elias Carmichael was not the man who had walked to the barn in November of 1889. The body was one thing, and the body was failing. The knees that would not unbend, the hands that would not still, the weight gone off him, until the chain hung loose around his waist. The faith was the other thing, and the faith had been turned inside out. He prayed now to be made clean by the work, and he prayed for the strength to endure the scouring, and he had begun to thank the brothers, silently, in his own heart, for the mercy they were performing on him. And he had begun to believe them. That's the detail the account carries that's worse than any wound, and it's set down here without comment, because no comment would make it heavier than it already is. The church at Stillhouse Creek wasn't entirely without an outside authority. The circuit, the string of congregations that ran over the ridges, had an elder over it, a man appointed to ride the round and visit each charge 4 times in the year, at the meetings they called the Quarterly Conference. In the spring of 1890 that elder was a man named Thaddeus Orr, 56 years old, thick through the middle, with a heavy jaw and hands that had gone soft from years of holding a Bible on a saddle more than an axe. He'd ridden the circuits of 3 counties for longer than Elias Carmichael had been alive, and he trusted nothing he hadn't seen with his own eyes. And he asked the same question 3 different ways before he believed the answer. Thaddeus Orr came up the hollow in the first week of April after the second winter, expecting the report Elias owed him for the circuit. The brothers met him at the door of the meeting room and told him Elias was still away, still riding the extended circuit down in Tennessee, and that his letters had been sporadic. Orr had been riding circuits long enough to know the smell of a story that had been rehearsed. He did not argue. He rode on, over the ridge, and he put the same question to the 2 neighboring congregations on the circuit, whether anyone there had seen Elias Carmichael through the winter. None of them had. None of them had even heard he was gone. Orr sat his horse at the last of those congregations, and he put the question to himself, in the way he put every question, 3 different ways, and each way of asking gave him the same answer, which was that Elias Carmichael hadn't been seen on any circuit in any season by any man who would know his face. The elder turned his horse back toward the ridge. He'd ridden long enough to know that a man who's gone down into Tennessee sends word to his charge, and a man who hasn't sent word hasn't gone down into Tennessee, and a deacon who says otherwise is saying a thing he's rehearsed. He rode back to Stillhouse Creek, and he went to the Ballard homestead, and he asked, plainly, to see the barn. The brothers refused. Orr did not raise his voice. He sat his horse at the yard gate, and he waited, the way an old man waits, who knows that waiting is itself a kind of pressure, and the only authority the hollow still recognized was the authority of the church, and Orr carried that authority, and the brothers knew it. Hiram went inside, and he was gone a long minute, and he came back out, and he unlocked the chain on the barn door, and he stood aside, and he did not say a word. Orr found Elias in the loft, chained to the tier pole, the heavy Bible still in his hands, open, the charcoal long cold in its ring of stones below. The man Orr found on the pallet was not the man who had walked into that barn in November. Orr looked at him the way a man looks at a thing he'll have to carry in his memory for the rest of his life, and the first thing Elias Carmichael did when the elder knelt beside him was ask Thaddeus Orr's forgiveness, because the rot was still in him, and the work was not finished, and he hadn't yet been made worthy of the mercy. The delusion had reached him, whole. That's the thing Orr walked into that morning, and it's the thing that doesn't leave a man who's seen it, however many years he carries it. The brothers did not run. They did not deny what they had done, and they did not plead, and they did not weep. Hiram looked at the elder across the open barn door, and he said, calm as a man reporting the weather, that the work was God's, and that it was not finished. He said it the way a man says a thing he's believed so long it's become a fact of his body. Enoch stood beside him with the ledger in his hand, the ledger he'd kept through both winters, and Silas stood behind them both and said nothing. That was the detail that indicted them more than the chain on the pole or the cold in the loft. They were not ashamed. They believed, to the last, that they'd done right. Thaddeus Orr took Elias out of the barn that morning. He wrapped him in a coat, and he put him on a horse, and he rode him down off the ridge to the nearest house, with a woman in it who would know what to do with a man who'd been kept in the cold for 2 seasons, and the rest of what was done for Elias's body isn't the point of this account. The body could be warmed and fed and rested. The body would mend mostly, in the way bodies mend when the cold and the hunger are taken off them, and the chain is cut away. What was done about the brothers is a place where the record goes thin. Orr sent word to the county seat for the sheriff, a day's ride down off the ridge, and the sheriff in that country in 1890 was a thin presence at the best of times, the law in the hollows running more on kinship and on the church than on any county writ. The dossier holds the matter as incomplete here, and what the secular authority did or did not do to the 3 Ballards isn't preserved in the part of the record that survive. Whether there was a trial, whether there was a sentence, whether the brothers were ever taken down off the ridge at all, the account doesn't say, and I won't invent it. What's preserved is enough, and it's worse than a verdict would have been. What's preserved is the ledger. Enoch Ballard's ledger, the one he kept in the breast pocket of his coat, the one he'd written in through both winters, in a steady, even hand. It held the dates. Night by night, across 2 seasons of snow, and beside each date the psalm that had been chosen for the work, and whether the fast had been kept, and how long the man had stood, and how long he had knelt. It was kept the way a man keeps a parish book, the columns straight, the hand careful, the entries made with the gravity of a clerk recording the business of the church. That's the document that indicts them, and it indicts them not because of what was done, but because of the hand that wrote it. The hand did not shake. The man who wrote those entries believed every one of them was an act of worship. Read down the columns of that ledger, the dates running on through the snows of 2 winters, and what's missing from it is the thing that would be in any honest record of suffering. There's no doubt in it. There's no night where a brother wrote that the work was hard, or that the man had suffered enough, or that the Lord's mercy looked, from the inside of the barn, like something else. The hand never hesitated. The columns run straight to the end, and the end is the morning. Thaddeus Orr opened the door, and the last entry is the night before, and it records a fast kept, and a psalm chosen, and a man stood in the dark, as though the work were any other labor of the church, and the man in the chain were only the field it was being done in. Isolation didn't make these men cruel. It let their cruelty keep the shape of faith, because in a hollow with no outside check, the only authority left was the authority the brothers already held over the soul of their preacher. and they used it patiently, and they used it in silence, until the silence in that barn became a thing with its own hunger. The wrongness didn't arrive as a stranger, or a fever, or a beast out of the trees. It arrived as three good men, in their coats, doing what they believed God had told them to do. And it stayed for 2 winters because no one was coming to tell them otherwise. The silence in that barn is the kind that doesn't leave a place, and Stillhouse Creek kept it the way the mountains keep the stories no one will speak aloud. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. The town, the country, the road if there's no town. I read every one of them